Dumelang, welcome to Face the Nation. My name is Clement Manyatela. Great to have you with us here on SABC News. On the show tonight, is Airports Company South Africa ready for the busy festive season? The company has already encountered 2 incidents since last week at OR Tambo International Airport that interrupted operations. So was it caught unprepared for this peak period? And how is ACSA going to ensure travelers' trips are not interrupted further? The CEO of ACSA, Mpumi Mpofu, joins us tonight. And then later, why is it that 30 years into our democracy, there's still no accountability emanating from the outcome of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? The failure of the NPA to prosecute TRC-related crimes remains a sore point for many families and struggle activists who died at the hands of the apartheid security forces. And this has led to questions and concerns about possible political interference preventing the prosecution of TRC cases. So on part 2 of our conversation with the NPA head, Advocate Shamila Batohi, we discuss why the NPA has failed to prosecute these cases and what is the prosecuting body doing to ensure that there's justice for the families of the victims. But first, my comment. So, South Africa is getting closer and closer to the possibility of hosting the Formula One Grand Prix. Yesterday, the Sports Minister, Gayton McKenzie, appointed a bid steering committee to oversee the process to find a promoter who will be the preferred host for the Grand Prix to help bring Formula One back to South Africa, hopefully in 2027. He indicated yesterday that it's time that Formula One returns to the African continent.
Lewis Hamilton, you said you had a dream to race in South Africa again. I'm standing here to tell you, we will not rest until your dream comes to a realization that you will race again in South Africa. Italy has 2 Formula One races. One country has 2, while a continent has nothing. We are the global south. We can't allow that. We must not be silent when we are being ill-treated. You just need to look at Formula One to know. We wish Rwanda well. We want Rwanda to get the Formula One. We want South Africa to get the Formula One. Why is it when it comes to Africa, we should be treated like we only can get 1, while you have Europe that has 7? It can't be.
Now, the CEO of the Kyalami Grand Prix says 90% of the work has been done, and by next year, the second should be Formula One certified.
We're 90% there, but the last 10% will be done next year. What has already been done is a plan, a detailed plan of what we have to do and how we have to do it. Kyalami, as you all know, is a viable business entity in its own right without Formula One, and it's very busy. So our job is to fit in the construction and not disrupt our business activities. But rest assured, by the end of next year, Kyalami will be F1 certified.
Now, the big question is, how much is it going to cost? And how accessible will the event be for the majority of South Africans, and not only the privileged ones? The minister estimated the cost of hosting this Formula One race to be around 2 billion rand, but he reassured the public that the financial burden would not fall primarily on the government, but there would still be a cost of some sort on the government. Here's the minister addressing the issue of costs and accessibility.
What people need to understand, Rwanda, a country that we are 30 times richer than Rwanda, and Rwanda wants this thing. We are twice as rich as Hungary, GDP, in terms of GDP. We are 5 times probably Azerbaijan, Baku. They have it. What am I trying to say to you? There's economic spin-offs. That's why they're trying to hold on to the spot on F1, because they see the spin-offs that they get from it. So sponsors, I mean, I've been inundated with sponsors wanting to put their money into the F1 Formula. Where I get involved as the minister is the ticketing prices, because I want to make, and the broadcasting rights, is to make sure a lot of people see it and a lot of people get access to watch a F1. And how I intend to do that? Very easy. I'm going to try to get the tickets at 2,000, 3,000 rands entrance. Saturday and Sunday, Friday will be a bit cheaper. But those are the tickets we're looking at, around 30,000 rands to go watch the race.
General access.
General access. Where are you going to pay? It is the paddock access, VIP. There we're going for 200,000. Whatever. If you can't complain, you must go to general if you complain. There you can't listen to people. Bo Mackenzie will watch a general because we're going to complain about paying 200,000. I want people that has money. They can. We are taxing the rich here in this instance. Yes. We want the rich to subsidize.
So here's the question we're asking you tonight. Do you think that South Africa should focus on raising this amount of money for the Grand Prix, given the competing social needs that we have? I mean, we are still faced with the triple challenges of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. We have gender-based violence that continues to raise its ugly head. So the point is, the needs are there. The areas where an amount of 2 billion rand could be spent, where value could be derived, but we can also focus on other areas that can put this country and continent on the map, because Formula One can boost the tourism industry. It can create jobs. There are other economic opportunities that come with hosting an event of this nature. The minister does say that there's been even significant interest from the private sector sponsors, including offers of about 400 million rand for hospitality rights, etc., that have already emerged. So, which side are you on this one? Do you think South Africa should focus on raising this amount of money, 2 billion rand, for the Grand Prix, given the competing social needs we have? Or do you think that there are great opportunities here that come with hosting these international sporting events? Let us know your thoughts on WhatsApp. You can send us a WhatsApp voice note right now on 078-459-1897. Remember to tell us your name and surname and where you're sending that voice note from. And please keep it at 30 seconds. Alternatively, you can go comment on X on @FaceTheNation SABC. We'll be back after the break. Welcome back. Now, the question we've been asking you tonight is whether South Africa should attempt to raise this estimated 2 billion rand to host the Formula One race, given the pressing social needs we have. Let's take a look at some of your response. Tabiso on Twitter says, I think South Africa should be given the chance to host the Formula One race because it would boost our tourism, and the global visibility from Formula One could attract international investment and improve South Africa's international profile. Diapo Jack says, no, they shouldn't even start fundraising because the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture should first raise the fund to build more theatres around the country to nurture young talents, and that will help teenagers always from the streets. I think the minister must prioritize the disadvantaged. Jose says we should be using that money to fix the immediate crises like water, public health care and basic education. Thank you so much for all your inputs. Let's look at this now. Airports Company South Africa has offered assurances on the state of readiness for the festive travel season after operational challenges led to delays just last weekend. Passengers experienced delays at passport control processing points due to some system failures. This incident was preceded by flight delays and cancellations due to issues with fuel bypass line earlier as well. ACSA CEO Mpumi Mpofu joins us now via video link. Mrs. Mpofu, thank you so much for making time for us. Good evening.
Good evening, Clement, and good evening to your viewers.
What is the volume of passengers are you expecting during this season, and are you equipped to deal with them considering the problems that were already encountered since last week?
Yes, no, thank you very much, Clement. What we've indicated is that this festive season we're expecting in excess of about 380 passengers. That's a combination of international passengers departures and arrivals and domestic passengers arrivals and departures. So effectively, we are facing an increase over the festive season travel this particular season, and we are ready, Clement. I must indicate that at Airports Company South Africa, we operate as an ecosystem that constitutes of the Airports Company, BMA, SABC, cargo airlines, ground handlers, and a variety of other role players and stakeholders who all execute together to deliver an excellent passenger journey. Now, the planning that we embark upon, starting from about September, which is quite detailed, is to make assessments and projections of the travel numbers that we are going to have. We have this detail and we're able to present it today, and that detail will provide you our projections for each day. We know when the peak days are, we know when the peak hours are, and all of us make this information available to all the stakeholders so that they can plan about their resourcing. And that means they must deploy adequate staff on the platform to be able to respond specifically to all of these requirements on a day-to-day basis, on an hour-to-hour basis, because we know when the passengers are come through. Tickets have been booked, therefore we can see the data. What actually happened was not related to planning. What we can define it as is exogenous events. One was the issue of jet fuel, which related to a sheared or shattered drive shaft, which actually created a problem in the refueling on the morning of the 9th. We were able to take that part, take it to the lab, test it, so we can determine a root cause. But we restored it. We're able, in addition, to also restore the valve that's associated with it. We are implementing another project that will ensure that by February we have a bypass. And in addition to the bypass, we have a project that will take 12 months from March. The design engineer was already in place from sometime this year, designing the system that is going to result in a new line to be implemented and completed by March 26. So it's not a planning issue. It's an unfortunate incident beyond our control, and that really relates to the jet line. We're waiting for the lab results, and we'll come back with that. But in the meantime, we've restored the system so that we don't have a further occurrence. The second is the BMA system. We also reported jointly with BMA today that they had a system that was unresponsive on the 15th, which resulted in delays in immigration and passport control. And this affected particularly the international side. What they've done in the system that they were implementing, it's a brand new system they were rolling out, and now they've converted back to the old one, and today they were implementing the laptops and everything to ensure by close of business today, we're back in the old system. It requires more, it's less complicated, and starting from tomorrow, which is our peak day, another peak day we have on the 20th will be rolling without incident.
I mean, is this the best time to be implementing new systems like that when you know that there's so many travelers that are coming through? I mean, surely the best way to test out systems is not during your peak times.
Oh, no, absolutely, Clement. But, you know, the systems we're talking about is basically the biometric movement control system of the Home Affairs, the old Home Affairs, and now Border Management Authority. Now, that system has been under implementation for some time, and it doesn't take a few months, Clement. Let me indicate what actually happens. It involves each passenger registering on the system and making sure that their credentials are registered on the system in order for it to work efficiently. It's been actually rolling out for more than 2 years now. So we went past the last festive season without incident with it. And this non-responsiveness is really a first-time thing that is happening. But previously, it had created problems for them in transitioning. They've now decided to scale down to the old system, which is still available to them, and they were installing all the equipment for that today. We will start again after the festive season and ensure that they can complete the exercise in off-peak time in the implementation. But we've been doing this for 2 years now. It is passenger-related, Clement, so it's not entirely up to us. It's you who go through and register your fingerprints and all of that, and basically ensure that you can be registered on the system. It's much more sophisticated than the old one, but I think we can revert to the simpler one, which is what the Commissioner of BMA, Border Management Authority, indicated today.
Okay, just another question on the refueling malfunction. That part that you speak about and the lab result that you're still waiting for, isn't the problem here also that there was a lack of maintenance? And that's part of the reason why this malfunction happened?
Clement, jet fuel is quite a complex system. I'm not sure anybody can reach a determination about lack of maintenance that easily. That's why ourselves as ACSA, in full transparency to the public, have said we're subjecting it to lab tests in order to determine the problem. So a number of options may come out from that lab test. One, they may say it is the torque of the drive shaft that was too high. They may also say the environment was acidic, which caused it to crack, and that would have resulted in that smithering and shearing of that part. Mm-hmm. They may also be able to indicate that the temperature was too high. I don't think anyone at this point outside of the laboratory that's been entrusted with this work can second guess what happened. Yes, we have a jet fuel system at ACSA, and we've been basically earmarked projects out of our 21.7 billion that is intended to upgrade and replace that, including the fuel farms basically that's coming down the line. So we know that this CAPEX, this capital expenditure was going to be implemented, but I'm not sure anybody can suggest lack of maintenance when we have stringent requirements. We're a highly regulated environment, and we have stringent requirements for basically a maintenance regime. Now, where might a problem arise? It might arise that we've been conducting maintenance now because of COVID beyond the number durability of the part, not because of lack of maintenance. It might be that over time, because we're not able, truthfully speaking, between 2019 with the advent of COVID in 2020 and 2024, when our funding was not available to embark on these projects. The money came in 1st of April. Immediately, we've gone out on tender and secured people who are going to implement these projects, and that's where we are.
Okay. Haven't you been promising, though, to put in the alternative bypass line for the past 2 years now?
Clement, we had an incident that happened in 2022. And in fact, that commitment around the bypass was made immediately after that particular incident. As I indicate to you, the bypass is going to be completed in February. And that's, again, Clement, a function of when does our funding come through? When do we go out on procurement? We're a creature of statute and we're governed by PFMA. When do we start implementing? So that bypass is really going to be completed in February. It was unfortunately not completed before the peak period, and the implementation is underway. In addition to the bypass, we have the brand new line that basically will start once the designs are completed again in February. In March, there's a contractor coming on board. They start implementing the brand new 20-inch line that then gets implemented and takes us to 2026, where it will be completed. In addition to that, we have a project that is about refurbishment of the fuel farms, which basically is the source where the jet fuel comes from. And all of that will then complete the jet fuel system that will be implemented in totality. Effectively, by the time we finish with that, in about 3 to 4 years' time, we'll have a brand new system altogether.
And in terms of the other ports of entry, because the 2 incidents that I mentioned were only, in my understanding, encountered at OR Tambo International Airports. You haven't picked up any other challenges in other ports of entry?
No, we haven't, Clement. And fortunately, in fact, the refurbishment work in those different other airports is also aligned to the issues related to those airports. So King Shaka, I must indicate, is a relatively new airport, and the challenges that we face there are unlikely to be similar to OR Tambo. Similarly, in Cape Town, there are no problems in this regard. I must indicate, though, that there is a project planned for a jet fuel intervention in Cape Town, but that's more related to security of supply and linking up to the Transnet pipeline, which would secure us a much more reliable source of jet fuel. You know the challenges we faced before when the security of jet fuel coming from imported sources creates a problem. But that's a different type of intervention we're making in Cape Town. But that's also another project we'll be implementing there. So the issues related to an incident are not things that we can plan for in a sense. It really is an unfortunate breakage of a part that we respond to urgently. We implement an intervention and we restore services in the way that we have demonstrated in OR Tambo. But we've checked the environment across the board. There isn't a indication that we will face a similar incident anywhere else on our ACSA network.
Yeah, and what about the financial health of airports company South Africa? And I know you've spoken earlier today about some of the claims that have been made about some possible liquidation and service providers that are also coming after the company. What's the state of your finances now? And are you at all facing liquidation?
Oh, definitely not, Clement. We aren't. We are as healthy financially as we've ever been. We declared a profit in excess of 450 million in this year, which is the first profitable year after COVID. We also, importantly, were able to pay dividends to the shareholders this year. More importantly, we're even able to ensure that all our shareholders are happy in this regard. So there isn't a chance that we're going to face liquidation. What has happened in this case is we are currently in arbitration with service providers who have claims against us, but we also have claims against them. The arbitration was intended to mediate and ensure that we finalize basically what is fair to claim and what is fair to pay so that the matter gets resolved. Part of it relates to what we perceive as claims that are made that have not been substantiated by the service providers. So a service provider says, I provided training during COVID, I want to be paid. They have to prove that they have to point invoices from training colleges. They have to show that basically that service was provided before we can pay. That's what this contestation is about. They have a right, though, in law, when they have a claim against us, to submit for liquidation when they think that we're not able to pay them. It doesn't make that claim valid. All it means is that they have submitted a claim for liquidation. ACSA is a going concern, confirmed by the Auditor General of South Africa. ACSA is profitable, audited by the Auditor General of South Africa. ACSA is in excellent health in this particular year. And ACSA is in a position to settle all its debt. The problem is we don't settle claims that have not been substantiated. And it's a very simple issue. We would be irresponsible to do so. But more importantly, we are in arbitration with these people. So they decide to abandon an arbitration process and go and submit a claim for liquidation. We don't think that is acting in good faith. But the process of arbitration continues. And where we have received claims or evidence for those claims and proof of service provider, we have paid. So it's not all the service providers. It's those that believe they should be paid without having to prove it.
And of course, they would have to prove that first. Mpumi Mpofu, thank you so much for making time for us. She's the CEO there at ACSA. After the break, we're going to do part 2 of our conversation with the NPA head, Shamila Batohi. Stay with us here on Face the Nation. Welcome back. Here's that question we've been asking you tonight on whether you think South Africa should attempt to raise an estimated 2 billion rand to host the Formula One race given the pressing social needs. More of your tweets. Mr. Miser says, good evening. For as long as the private sector is in the forefront financially, I don't see the problem. Tapelo says, I'm in favor of this project. The economic spin-offs are huge. The multiplier effect is amplified. Route development for airlines, tourism, auto industry benefits. Some of the fans would likely return after that and get a taste of our hospitality. Soli says, yes, it should be given a chance to host this event. Maybe it will help the nation and the tourism will improve. All right, we've also received some of your WhatsApp voice notes as well. So let's take a listen to what you have had to say on the voice note line.
Good evening. This is Poro from Pumalang. I think South Africa should try to raise the money to host the F1, and the minister is on the right track here. It's not so often that I agree with the minister, but I agree with him on this one. Because there will never be a time when he will tick all the boxes when it comes to social needs. So we can walk and chew the gum at the same time. We can work on the social needs while doing other things on the side, like raising the money for the F1. That's my opinion. Good evening.
It's Ndwandwe here. So if they put in an estimate of 2 billion and the view of all the things, the possibilities that we may get, can we get exactly what we'll be able to get if we were to get this F1 coming to our country? Because the 2 billion rand could be used somewhere useful. Thank you.
Welcome back. Now, the National Prosecuting Authority says it has taken important steps to investigate and prosecute cases from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This year, the NPA employed about 15 prosecutors and 32 South African Police Service investigators focused on TRC matters. They've registered about 137 cases for investigation, with 21 finalised and 10 currently on the court roll. Advocate Shamila Batohi joins us once again in studio for part 2 of our conversation with her. The first part of our conversation was focused on state capture cases, and this part is focused on TRC matters and, of course, other issues. Advocate, welcome back. Thank you so much for making time again.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure being back to deal with the other aspects of the work of the NPA. And in part 1, we dealt primarily on state capture. And as we know, state capture ripped the heart out of the rule of law. It brought our country to its knees. We are still reeling from the effects of state capture. And so this has been a top priority, state capture, for the NPA from day one. And we recognize, we haven't made as much progress as we should. And, the NPA is coming for a lot of criticism for that. But I think it's important today that we actually look into the broader work of the NPA as well, because, it's the rest of the work of the NPA is tarnished with that same negative brush of state capture. And, it undermines morale in the NPA because most of our prosecutors are doing this work every day. And so it's really important that, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. So I'm really pleased that today, we are, having looked at state capture, that today we look at the other aspects of the work of the NPA. And, we have to really look realistically at what has been done and what more needs to be done for us to instill confidence in the rule of law in this country.
Speaking of what's been done, let's look at with just the TRC cases, for instance, cases that have arisen from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's over 30 years or so, 30 years later, and we still really haven't moved that much on TRC cases. What's going on then? What are you doing as the NPA to try and make sure we see some prosecutions?
When I took office in 2019, reeling from state capture, a broken and fractured organization that we needed to rebuild, we had many, many priorities, including TRC matters, which you correctly state. For 30 years, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but, prosecutions thereafter, and, many people were granted amnesty in that process, but many people didn't. And we can go into the long history of why this didn't happen over, the period of 30 years. But when we took office, as you mentioned the figures earlier on, working with General Labia in the DPCI, we realized we needed to have a dedicated capacity to bring people to account for TRC matters. Time is not on our side. We have suspects that are dying, we have witnesses that we are dying, and we have families that don't feel they have received justice. So we have, this dedicated capacity working with the DPCI Currently, there are 126 cases that are under investigation. 104 new investigations have been opened since 2021. Since September 2021, the original findings of 5 inquests have been overturned. So what we've done is, where inquests were held many years ago, you know, many of them found that it was suicide and didn't really find that, you know, the state apparatus was responsible for the death. So we reopened these inquests where we had new evidence. And in fact, in 2025, there are some inquests that are going to be reopened, including that of Mr. Griffiths Mtenge, Chief Lutuli, and Mr. Boy Manti. Those are 3 of several that will be open next year. There are 6 matters on the criminal court rolls at the moment, and the first post-September 21 conviction was secured in 2023 September, when the accused was sentenced to 10 years direct imprisonment. So there's a lot of work going on in terms of trying to hold people accountable. And, you know, I think there's been good progress, but still a lot needs to be done.
How difficult is it to prosecute these cases? Because, as you know, some of the people are no longer with us who have been accused. Sometimes it can really be difficult to find the direct evidence that can send these people to jail. So do you have the capacity to deal with the complexity of these cases?
That has been one of the major challenges. And it's not just the capacity in the prosecuting authority. Remember, the DPCI investigates and so works very closely with the prosecution as a team. You're absolutely right. Some of the evidence, it's many years have passed. You know, looking at the archives, looking at TRC records, you know, witnesses have passed on. Some witnesses, especially when you're looking at trying to get evidence in the state apparatus at the time, a lot of that evidence was destroyed. So documentary evidence is destroyed because people, of course, don't want to be held accountable. So it has been an extremely difficult process. But, you know, we have a team together and they are, you know, really working hard to try to overcome these challenges that we have. But these are not easy matters to prosecute. Also, where witnesses come forward, you know, the passage of time, people also forget, you know, so even though they may have, depends on whether they made statements earlier on. If they didn't, it's very difficult after such a long time to really recall details. But those are all part of the challenges.
But I mean, it's great to hear that there's some cases that are being put forward, because I always talk about, just as a country, how do we move forward? I mean, when we talk about reconciliation, when there are cases that have been referred for prosecution since that important TRC process, and yet we haven't seen really successful prosecutions, that doesn't really give us hope as a country, because the families need justice. South Africans who may not have been affected by the deaths of these individuals also need justice. And I think it's so important that as the NPA, as the Hawks, a lot of work is done in pushing these cases. But you need support from government as well. Has there been political will? Because one of the things I think you have done as the head of the NPA is ask Advocate Dumisa Ntsebeza to investigate whether anyone could face charges for alleged interference in the prosecution, because this was something else that was constantly being asked. Was there interference? Is that why we didn't see the prosecutions? Where is that? And do you think that could be the case why these cases were not moving?
So let me say firstly, to deal with the issue of families seeking justice and things not moving fast enough for the families. What we have also done is we have engaged in family engagements. We call them accountability sessions to the families, where we meet with families with regard to investigations that are continuing, cases that are on the court roll, and to make them understand where we are at. So even though they may not, they may want things to move quicker, at least they have a good understanding of where things are at and what the process could be moving forward. So that's really important. On the issue of Advocate Ntsebeza, we brought him on board to look primarily at whether what the NPA had put in place was sufficient to deal with investigations, prosecuting these cases. And so that was his mandate, is to assess, what the NPA had put into place. And so he did that, and his finding was that he was largely satisfied with what had been put in place to be able to deal with these issues. On dealing with political interference, I mean, there's been the Rodriguez case where the judge actually found that there was political interference in these matters. And so, that is a finding of a court. And so I suppose, there was also statements made by prosecutors that alluded to the fact that there was political interference at the time. So we have worked from the premise in the NPA that we have to deal with accountability now in terms of holding people accountable with prosecutions or inquests, reopening inquests. So that is what we are focusing on. So, the issue of political interference, as I said, there have been statements made to that effect.
Yeah. But being in the privileged position that you're in now and having been able to push for these cases, does it make sense that after so many years we didn't see any movement?
All I can say is, look, the TRC, there was a unit that was set up to deal with these matters. And, from what the court has found in the Rodriguez matters, there was a level of political interference. And in fact, Advocate Vusi Pikoli, who was the national director before I took office, has also made a statement to indicate that there was interference at the time. So, I wasn't, dealing with these matters at the time, but one can accept from what they have said is that there was a level of interference at the time. Okay.
I want us to look at what other cases you deal with as the NPA. The last time when we focused on state capture, we spoke about how those kind of cases account for, 1% or so of the bulk of cases you normally deal with. What are some of the cases you deal with as the NPA, and what is the conviction rate?
So before I deal with the cases themselves, the other part of the work of the NPA, besides state capture, relates to a whole range of other crime types, which we will deal with. But it also, the other part of the work of the NPA also dealt with building a capable and strong institution, which was, as we know, decimated during state capture. So when I took office in 2018, in addition to the crisis of crime and state capture, we needed to look at how do we rebuild an NPA into a strong institution, which is one of the requirements of the Sustainable Development Goals of the NPA, is to have strong institutions. So at that point, I committed to dealing with the leadership crisis, to securing a budget, to looking at reviewing high-profile cases that my predecessor had either prosecuted in or not prosecuted in. And those were all done. We have solid leadership. I've reviewed several cases, overturned decisions. And so we've, at the time, the morale of the staff was low. You had to build the morale of the staff. So we've been looking at budget advocacy, looking at resourcing the NPA, capacitating it primarily in areas relating to corruption, dealing with corruption. That's the commercial crimes unit, asset forfeiture unit. So a lot of work went into all of that, And so the challenges of the crime crisis in this country, the other crime types, is one that we've been addressing, and we are now taking a prioritization approach, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But your question on the performance, I mean, since 2021, the performance of the NPA has gone up 60%. We started off with about 50% performance. It went up to about 72, 75, and we're thereabout in terms of the performance of the NPA across the board.
What do you base that on?
There are certain measures that, we have in terms of how we perform, and we measure our performance. It relates to conviction rates in the various district court, regional courts, in the high courts. It relates to dealing with corruption matters. It relates to asset forfeiture recovery. So on all of these, our performance has been increasing. As I said, state capture is not the only form of corruption we deal with. There's lots of other corruption cases outside of state capture. And there's over 1,000 private sector persons that have been prosecuted. And I don't have the figures here, but I think about 300 and some auto. Yeah, no, I'm not sure about that, but a number of government persons have also been. So all of these figures are taken into account, and that's how the performance is based, you know.
And speaking of building capacity even within the NPA, one of the things we saw during the state capture project is that there were people who worked for the NPA who didn't really have the interests of this country or even the interest of justice at heart. What have you done to make sure that you deal with the rot within the organization? People who are still there, who probably are there because they want to defend certain people or because they still support certain people, and that compromises on the work that they do.
So I'm hoping we'll get to the other work of the NPA as well, but this is important. You know, there were, you know, there's internal processes, that disciplinary processes in respect of a number of staff members that were allegedly compromised. With the one senior member of staff, it has been publicly stated, I have requested the president to consider conducting an inquiry into the person's fitness to hold office. And so we have to, you know, await the president's decision on that. So there's, you know, what we could do as the NPA, we are doing, but sadly and frustratingly, these internal disciplinary processes really take a long time at times. And the national directors just got to, you know, respect processes. And so that's what we do. But these cases really do take a long time.
And I want us to get into the asset forfeiture unit in a moment and the work that you've done there, but still on the issue of just stability of leadership. How stable is the ID right now, the investigative directorate? As you have seen, I'm sure you've seen Hermione Cronier speaking about how there was a crisis, and that's one of the reasons why she had left the NPA. Was there a crisis, and is the ID capacitated sufficiently to deal with the complex cases that it's on its desk?
Look, there's no crisis in the NPA. There's a lot of challenges. And, you know, I think when we try to assess, you know, the capacity issues and, you know, whether the NPA is actually dealing with state capture cases adequately, I have already, you know, I've said that's the one area where we've actually not done well, and we've dealt with various capacity issues. So although there are capacity challenges, there's certainly not a crisis in leadership. So I think that there must be a clear distinction between those two. So if you ask me whether there's a crisis in the ID, no, there's no crisis, but certainly there are many challenges, and we dealt with some of them in part one of the session. But there's still a lot of, you know, we've been working with, now that the ID is permanent, and we dealt with this in part one again, we are looking at capacitating permanent staff, you know, and looking at working with business to set up a digital evidence unit, which we covered as well. So there's a lot of work going into making sure that the ID has the capabilities to deal with these cases quickly.
So whenever we look at the prosecution of cases, normally we think of just getting people in orange overalls and them being behind bars. But part of the work is also about recouping some of the money that has been stolen or some of the money that was lost through corruption. How have you done on that front as the NPA? I know you've dealt with McKinsey, they've managed to pay back some money. Can you take us through how much money have you been able to recover as the NPA through the various, especially corruption cases you've dealt with?
So it's really important to note that accountability, we have a two-pronged strategy to deal with accountability. One is prosecutions and orange overalls, or justice at the end of the day. And the second one is bringing back the stolen money. As we know, billions have been stolen from this country, not just through state capture, but various forms of corruption, organized criminality as well. It's all about money. So we put together a very bold and ambitious asset recovery strategy and an implementation plan, which we're monitoring, focusing basically also on non-conviction-based recovery. And what that means is it's not dependent on a criminal trial, on a conviction, which we know takes a long time so by the time, it's years with Stalingrad tactics, if it's conviction-based, it could take a long time before we recover the money. So we're focusing on non-conviction based, we're focusing on organized crime, international asset recovery. And so overall, with regard to your figures, since 1999, so I'm going back quite a distance. Well, that was when the unit was set up. They have frozen 30.38 billion rands. They've confiscated and forfeited about 13 billion. They've recovered just around short of 12 billion, and 4.89 billion has been paid into the criminal asset recovery account. Now, the important thing about this is that 46% of all the freezing orders, that's not the final orders, but the freezing orders, because it's a two-step process, 37% of confiscation and forfeitures, and 44% of all recoveries from inception of the asset forfeiture unit has been attained in the past 5 years. So it is reflective of our very vigorous asset recovery strategy. Part of this is, you mentioned the McKinsey, is the corporate alternate dispute resolution mechanism that we've put into place. And as a result of this, we've had 3 resolutions. The ABB case, 2.5 billion rands. The SAP case, 2.2 billion, and now McKinsey with 1.1 billion. And so all of this money goes into the criminal assets recovery account. And this is an account which only the AFU of the NPA puts money into. And the importance of this money can be demonstrated by the fact that government's response to illegal mining, complete response. Recently, people will be reading a lot more about law enforcement efforts in trying to deal with illegal mining. About 2.2 billion rand was taken from CARA to completely fund government's response to illegal mining. So it shows how important it is that asset forfeiture is part of the strategy to hold people accountable.
Why isn't that money also being used to assist the NPA with the financial constraints?
The way this money is utilized is that there's a committee of 3 ministers, that is the Minister of Finance, Minister of Justice, and Minister of Police, and the National Director, that sits and discusses and decides how to do this. So the National Director is not the only one. And so you have, at a DG's level, there's a lot of discussion about how this money should be spent to help law enforcement. So the National Prosecuting Authority got a very small slice of the money. But I suppose we have to look at the bigger picture sometimes. But I think you make an important point that with asset recovery, we've got to put more money into it because it's self-funding and it brings more money into the fiscus that can be used across law enforcement. But just on asset recovery, another big case, to give you an idea, the Optimum coal mine was a huge, one of the major Gupta-related assets that was seized by the asset forfeiture unit. That matter is finalized and the mine was sold and the money is put into CARA. But this is a huge case where the mine is almost as big as Singapore, and we had to deal with a number of stakeholders, including the community, trade unions, saying people were going to lose jobs, etc. So there were a lot of challenges with this matter. But it shows this is really a very important example of one of the key Gupta assets having been recovered, sold, and now it's a good indication of how the asset forfeiture unit can work to actually bring back the stolen money.
Yeah, and still on the issue of funding and capacitating the NPA, do you think there's a need for a change maybe in the legislative framework, particularly concerning the lack of financial independence for the NPA as an institution? Because you still report to the Minister of Justice.
This is a very, very important issue. And I think, to be very clear, the NPA does not have a problem with the responsibility of a minister over a national prosecuting authority. There are very few, if any, countries around the world where a national prosecuting authority is completely separate from the executive. So that line is, we don't have a problem with that line. We've had ministers that have respected that line, and so that is not a challenge for the NPA. But the operational and financial independence is a major issue, and that is because the Director General of Justice is the accounting officer of the National Prosecuting Authority. And so that really undermines the leadership of the NPA in many, many ways. And it actually hampers the effectiveness of the NPA in many ways. So this matter was squarely dealt with and raised by many civil society organizations in the course of parliamentary debates in the run-up to the NPA amendment bill becoming an act that created the ID. This was raised squarely there. And the previous minister committed to Parliament, that's Minister Lamola, that there will be a bill in Parliament in 2025, January, that will address the broader reforms of the NPA. And it's important to note that it's not just the minister, the president also, in his report to Parliament on the recommendations of the Zondo Commission, also stated that the issue of the NPA's financial and operational independence must be dealt with. So this is a matter that is, if you want to have a truly independent prosecuting authority, you need to have financial and operational independence. And I'm certainly hoping that with the new minister, who I will meet very soon, we will be able to deal with this issue together with the department as a matter of extreme urgency.
Yeah, and I know that as part of capacitating, given the limited financial resources, you've been looking at the help of the private sector as well. How much of that is really coming into shape, and how do you also just become cautious here, because you don't want the private sector to start hovering over your independence and the National Prosecuting Authority? So have you been able to get the assistance of the private sector, and also how do you make sure that you're cautious so that the lines are not blurred?
That's a very important question, and that balance that you talk about is critical. So let me firstly say that dealing with the private sector is not a new thing in government. That the prosecuting authority, many, many years ago, over 20 years ago, the private sector assisted in setting up the specialized commercial crime units and the courts in the department, in the justice system. They've helped significantly in dealing with Tutuzela care centers with regard to sexual and gender-based violence issues. With regard to working with the private sector, and it is also, it's an international good practice. In fact, our international instruments require us to engage with a whole range of actors in society, including with the private sector, in order to be more efficient in what we do. So what we've done is, within the context of the presidential initiative, the president's initiative with business, and there's three streams there, dealing with logistics, Transnet, dealing with energy, Eskom, and the third stream is crime and corruption. So under that presidential initiative, we've engaged with business, and they are setting up a digital evidence unit, which is going to be outside of the NPA. It'll be demand-driven in terms of what we require will be dealt with by this particular unit. It is hoped that in due course, this unit will be able to be taken over by government to be able to support government entities. But right now, given where we are with the financial constraints, we are working within the presidential initiative. Yeah. But in addition to that, we have an MOU with business, working with business against crime. So the NPA does not take any money from business at all. But working through this MOU, depending on what services we require, they are sourced, and then we receive services.
All right. Advocate, I'm almost out of time. I want you to touch on the gender-based violence cases as well that you deal with as the NPA. Have you been making progress on those?
So, this is it's a national priority. It's a scourge. The president of this country has said that the men of this country have waged war on women. And so we have a sexual offences and community affairs unit in the National Prosecuting Authority. This has been also another one of our priorities. The Tutuzela care centers, which we set up working with a range of partners in and outside of government, police, the Department of Health, Social Welfare, is really an example of a one-stop center that provides all kinds of services, a range of support services to victims on their road to becoming survivors. There were a number of Tutuzela care centers, around 55 when we took office, over the period of 20 years since they started. In the past 3 years since we appointed a new director, that has now gone to 66. So there have been 11 in the past, 65 or 66 in the past 3 years, and primarily, again, because of business support. business has come to the table and funded a lot of the new centers that we've set up and refurbished many of the existing centers. Okay. So a lot of work is happening, but the reality is that, again, I don't think we're not going to be able to prosecute ourselves out of the scourge. You really need an all of society. You need upfront, you need, you know, the religious community, schools, education, parents. We need to understand why is it that the men of our country are violating women in this way. We come at the end as a prosecuting authority and as police once the violation has already happened. And although our conviction rate in the Thuthuzela Care Center related cases has increased from around just over 60% to about 77, we are still, you know, we have a lot of work to do. And if you compare conviction rate to the number of reported cases, it dwindles down to about 10. So there's a lot of work. You know, most women don't receive justice, but we are trying really hard in the Thuthuzela Care Centers to try to make their journey to becoming survivors something that is bearable. All right. Advocate Shamila Batohi, thank you so much for making time for us. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And thanks to you for watching the Thursday edition of Face the Nation. We'll be back with you on Tuesday next week at 8 p.m. Thanks for watching. Cheers.